So first, a big hello and a big welcome. And we are here to talk about seeing mental health through new eyes. We are excited and humbled to have this group of panelists here. Thank you all for being here with us. And there are a few logistics that I need to say first. So a little bit about IIHW, that's the USC's Institute for Integrative Health and Wellness. And we are here, we've been here for about 12 years, and we are here to promote health and healing for individuals, families, and communities. We look at science, and we look at science from many different perspectives, from conventional perspectives, from indigenous perspectives, and we really are trying to broaden the lens of how we see health and healing. Our vision is to transform healthcare by establishing a collaborative, holistic paradigm. And we know that in order to do that, all aspects of human life need to be looked at. So physical, emotional, mental, spiritual, cultural, social, and environmental. If the earth is not healthy, we are not healthy. If we are not healthy, the earth is not healthy. And we're going to talk about that, I'm sure, today as well. And USC has a land acknowledgement, and I'm going to make it a little bit more personal. I want to say that we know that USC and all of us live on lands that have been taken from our first peoples. USC is mostly on the Gabrielino Tongva people's land, who have taken care of this land beautifully and are still taking care of this land. We want to recognize those people. We want to recognize that many people have been forced from their homelands. We want to recognize and respect all of these people and all of the other indigenous people who have been on this land and still are on the land where USC has many different hubs. So we want to recognize the Chumash, Tataviam, Serrano, Cahuilla, the Juaneno and Luiseno people. We want to pay respects to their past and to their present. May this be a reminder to where we live. May this be a reminder of some of our past. And I want to encourage everyone to find out where their home is and the generations of people that have been on your home where you live. Who has taken care of all of the lands where you have been living? And perhaps we can pray. I hope that we can pray that we all take better care of our land together. A little bit more back to logistics. We need to use EADS for CME credit. So if you don't have an account, please go ahead and download it. And our activity code is 86EMEU. So if you want credit, go ahead and do that. That's really important. We have a lot of people to thank. I want to thank the Office of Religious and Spiritual Life. They took us under their wing and they support what we do. IHW, of course, and here's the steering committee and executive staff. I want to thank everyone on this list who has worked tirelessly to try to bring new, informed conversations to health and wellness on the USC campus and beyond. And if you're interested in this, coming to a screen near you, we have our next quarterly symposium topic, which is MDMA-assisted psychotherapy. We don't have a date yet, but look at our website and you'll see when we're going to do that. So I'm going to stop sharing at this point. I want to say a little bit about why we're here today. We're here today because we want to see mental health and our overall health through a wider lens. We see healing as a sacred and holy act of deep listening, community as medicine, that we are larger stories than we think or that we believe. We are bigger than any diagnosis, and there is much to learn from the world of integrative medicine and indigenous wisdom and the earth herself. I am Toby Fischel. I'm a clinical and health psychologist, and I'm on the steering committee of IHW. I'm the GME Wellness Director here at the Keck School of Medicine. And I have the privilege of knowing all of our panelists here in a variety of different ways. I have been in talks with them. I have learned from them. I have their books, their poetry. I've been able to sit next to them and really learn what it means to deeply, deeply listen. So I'm very proud to have everyone here. And our first panelist that I'm going to introduce is Dr. Omid Naim. He received his MD actually from USC's Keck School of Medicine. So this is a coming home for him, which is really exciting how far we've come. He is trained conventionally as a child and adolescent psychiatrist. And then he was trained in integrative medicine and also from many wisdom healing traditions. He started Hope Integrative Psychiatry and La Maida. He works with the YMCA to create holistic healing opportunities. He'll talk more about that. And I want to share one quote that I found about him. Dr. Naim describes a holistic approach that not only integrates many healing traditions like medicine, yoga, talk therapy, but he seeks to help the mind, body, and spirit heal together, that healing comes from within, and that meaning and spirituality are the backbones of well-being. I know that is true. I know that he believes that. We all believe that. And we're so happy that you're here, Dr. Omid Naim. Thank you.
Thank you, Toby, so much for that opening. So I'm going to share my screen now, and I take on the task I created for myself of trying to get through almost 30 slides in 18 minutes. Let's see if I can. I'm clearly the youngest on the panel. I'm trying to say a lot. I'm trying to do something where I'm really at the intersection of mainstream medicine and these alternative, indigenous, holistic approaches, and to really use science to make inroads. And I'm here representing both a private practice center that I've created, Hope Integrative Psychiatry, as well as La Maida Project, which is a nonprofit that I founded. I start with presenting the really sad statistics of how poorly we are doing. These rates of disability since the 1950s, then 80s, they correspond to the big waves in the medical use, psychoactive medication use. The first big wave was in the 50s, then the 80s. The statistic on opiates really is the most astounding that we, and I think that it's, to me, this story is really unique, that our culture is so founded on self-reliance and individualism. It's the core of our culture. Yet, if you look at how our outcomes, we are extremely dependent in our behavior. And when I went through training, the story was that we haven't diagnosed properly enough. We haven't seen these treatments work long enough. And I think that the failure is really evident. Current mental health treatment is very incoherent. It's rested especially on a chemical imbalance theory that has no actual evidence. This idea of stability is supposed to be our goal, when up until the 1970s, NIMH, APA, all supported for as long as known that depression, anxiety, these are acute conditions that you recover from completely. And this idea of chronicity was not here. And so we have no expectation of recovery. We have all these different incoherent models that are pieces of the pie. And we study sickness and we tell people that you are the problem and that you need to be fixed. So ACE is really, the adverse childhood experiences study is what can be the beginning of a turning point to rewrite the story. That's Lameda Project's mission statement, to rewrite the story. If you've heard me say story now several times, because I think the stories we're telling are the key. So for people who don't know, I'm going to try and go through it, but go through it fast to get to the rest. Adverse childhood experiences study starting in the late 1990s, studied over 17,000 people across all socioeconomic classes and ethnicities, tracked for early signs of adversity, stress, trauma. These were, if you had one of these in your childhood, you had an ACE score. And they followed people into adulthood, and this has been replicated multiple times. A direct link between the number of ACE, adverse childhood experiences you had, ACE score, and these lifelong developmental problems to your health. And very direct link, as the ACE score goes up, your risk of having these chronic health conditions and mental health issues increases. So that's fantastic that we can begin to talk about trauma. We can begin to talk about stress. However, we need to go further. And this is where, my work begins and what Lameda Project's story is. We ask, I say, what about the other 60%? These ACE scores correspond. Like if you have three ACE scores, you have a 40% chance of having a mental health issue. So what about the other 60% though? What's happening in the others that go through those same adverse experiences, right? What is it about their environment, their experiences? What's happening that is producing the resilience needed to overcome trauma and stress? So there is a lot of research on resilience factors, protective factors. ACEs has its own protective factors. There's a lot of research on faith, spirituality, gratitude, purpose, meaning. I think also we need to look at the abundant social determinants of health data, talking about how loneliness, isolation socially, big studies that show the degree to which that affects our health, greater than obesity, nicotine, tobacco smoking, all these things. And also look at the epidemiological data, that shows that mental illness is really happening in Western culture. And I think if you put all of that together, it's like the forest for the trees, going from the reductionistic data to like, what's the real story? And I think the story is an ecological story, right? An ecological lens is how we study health in all other organisms. We study all organisms in the universe through an ecological lens, except for human beings. We study what is the relationships, what is the environment that this organism evolved to thrive in, right? So like that's a card you get when you buy a house plant. Gives you a card that says how much water, how much sun, what kind of soil, how to care for this organism for it to thrive. And from an ecological model, if you don't water the plant properly and you get brown leaves, we don't call that brown leaf disease, right? So the story we're telling is really critical because the story orients how we see the problem and how we behave to respond to it. So an ecological lens means that there's different dimensions that make up the whole: physical, emotional, mental, spiritual, physical environment. And then when all the parts are in flow, we are optimally healthy. We survive through the stress and challenges that we evolved to thrive in. Trauma is something we evolved to thrive through. It is our heritage. The problem is not trauma. So I think a really big influence on me was this book by Sebastian Unger on homecoming and belonging. He shows that actually mental health usage goes down after crises. Um, After 9/11, mental health usage went down, I think, almost 50% in the year to two after 9/11 in New York City. And what he talks about is that we evolved needing to rely on each other through struggle, and it is through struggle that our deeper resilience comes out. It's on behalf of each other. It's on behalf of each other in struggle through meaningful experiences that the qualities that we need to face stress come out, that benefit us. And that it's our values and the fact that we actually don't need each other anymore in modern life. That's meaning that we don't have these experiences that bring out actually the best in us. So what are our natural conditions? You know, I put up the slide of this pack of zebras because we really have most of our circuitry that feels alive, that feels meaningful, that feels connected. Sense of belonging is what this pack of zebras experiences when it's running in a pack. Sensing each other, feeling each other, being aware of each other. The one that loses the pack is the one that gets eaten. So we are designed biologically, heavily in our circuitry, to sense and connect with each other, for our stress response to find regulation, for our emotions to find regulation. And it's in that state in which competition and cooperation are not seen as antagonized and antagonistic to each other, but actually one thing. My optimal competitiveness is in how I sense and coordinate with others, and my optimal cooperativeness comes out by my optimal competitiveness. And I think that equates to the experience of authenticity and belonging. And I'm going to go a little deeper into that. And when those are in flow, our stress responses sync up and our emotions also sync up. So this is the conundrum for human beings. It's like Humpty Dumpty fell off the wall. We're designed for small, tight bands of people that are cooperating together, and our bodies, it's body to body felt sense in which our stress responses sync up and that our emotions complete. And it's in deep states of belonging where we can be ourselves. So authenticity needs belonging, and belonging, true belonging, only happens when there's authenticity. It's a circuit, and it's a circuit that's actually very morally oriented. It really depends on how you act. It's how you show up. It's how you show up on behalf of yourself, each other, the ecosystem that you're responsible to care for. So our emotions are embodied and they're also moral. Now, wholeness is a principle of ecological health. Wholeness is how optimal health is seen through an ecological approach. And wholeness argues, like as Freud had made an argument of what are the core drives that drive human nature. The sexual drive, aggression. So from an ecological perspective, we actually share with all of life just two basic core drives: self-correction and self-completion. Keep it together and fulfill your innate potential. You go from a hot bath to a cold bath, a hot day to a cold day, you stay at 98.7 degrees. That's self-correction, that's healing. If there's energy left over, you grow. So you adapt and then you grow. And that's the basic function of all life. And I think that we experience that on a human level in terms of the basic thing we're always trying to do, that you can tap into it right now, is keeping it together. And then the other thing one experiences at a deep level is this sense of, am I on my authentic path? So if people have heard of Bruce Perry, he's a trauma expert, getting a lot of chance to put out his theories through his relationship with Oprah Winfrey. he introduced to me that his neurosequential model that is focused on the bottom-up regulation theory of the brain. And I think that the bottom-up regulation theory of the brain is a way to map our wholeness, our ecological health. Because what he's talking about is the need to look at where trauma lives. Trauma lives in the brainstem. It's in our primitive brain circuitry. It's the autonomic part of our brain that regulates our internal system in response to moment-to-moment stress. And it's the fastest processing in the brain. Our brains process information bottom up. You know that if you're on a job interview or on a first date and you're starting to have a little bit of a panic in your body, and it hijacks your ability to connect. And that inability to connect means you can't think clearly. So really what we are is we need to look at the brain evolutionarily as something that is conservative. It builds on itself. We are reptiles that became mammals, where we were able to then regulate optimally through cooperation. That's where love, community, that sense of connection, that means we could co-regulate. We go from self-regulation to co-regulation. And then what humans are, we are regulating through stories. That's the innovation. Rather than 20 people coordinating through 20 zebras coordinating through felt sense, we can organize thousands. We can carry traditions that are stories that are told in sweat lodges from 1,000 years ago to 1,000 years from now. A way to organize, to regulate together through values. And those values, when we sync up, bring us back to that state of authenticity and belonging where our mental health is optimal. And so where did we go off track? The evolution of the mind-body disconnect is when we began to develop the ability to think. That meant we could cooperate beyond emotional intimacy. That created our opportunity to become creative, but also we could alienate from our bodies and our emotions. And that meant greater capacity for fulfillment, but also the opportunity for emptiness through disconnection and disassociation. And I think this is the fall from grace. And this is what all wisdom traditions are talking about. You know, we ate from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. In the Torah, it says, you will then rule the earth, but it will be cause of your greatest suffering. So there's that creativity, but alienation, the serenity prayer. What can I control? What can I not? As well as the Buddha's message, the illusion of judgments, the attachment that creates alienation, the pain versus suffering. So can science become a wisdom tradition? Because that's what happened. Once cognition came in, civilizations created integrative practices, ways to get back in our bodies, back to connected with each other, synced up around shared values, becoming aware of the interconnected, interdependent nature of all things. Because the problem is in the way we are living. We, since the 1800s, have progressively created lives of greater disconnection from the land, from each other. You know, the nuclear family is a total experiment. Over 100 years ago, the average house had 13 people living in it. Multiple eyes, multiple ears, multiple hearts, more attachment figures. And then with the internet, mobile phones, greater and greater phasing out of the felt sense. And this is really the root cause, not trauma. The problem is the stories we're telling about human nature. Because the stories we've been telling ourselves, starting with psychoanalytic theories, are disconnecting us further. Each bringing a reductionistic truth to human nature and mental illness, but isolating the truth, not telling the whole story. So salutogenesis is the field created by sociologists, Israeli sociologists who studied Holocaust survivors, wanted to know why some thrive while others do worse. And what he pinpointed was this sense of coherence in individuals that seem to go through trauma and stress and thrive. This sense of coherence, he said, depended on three factors: communities that embed in the individuals a belief that when bad things happen, they're comprehensible, manageable, and most importantly, that they're meaningful. And when I read that, what I say is that's the story, that's the art of storytelling. That's the hero's journey. That's the elders sitting around a campfire. That's the elders taking us into sweat lodges, telling us that the universe is understandable, that it's manageable if we rise to the occasion, acquire new skills. And in doing so, we join the community, we join the tribe, we become a part of something meaningful. That life is about adapting and growing, not about sickness. So I think that the brain, the bottom-up regulation theory of the brain, allows science to become a wisdom tradition, that there is a circuit in which we are optimal, that we are whole, and that our self-actualization is one of creative purpose to care for ourselves and each other and the ecosystem. I think it maps bottom-up regulation perfectly to Maslow's hierarchy. And so what Lameda is doing, so getting into like action and execution, like Lameda Project has this blueprint approach for organizational transformation, where the organization sees itself as an ecosystem. So an ecosystem has those dimensions. Those can be more compellingly seen as physical activities, how we care for our physical space, how we care for each other in relationships in the organization itself, how we relate to each other, our food, our values, and our culture, as well as for mental health organizations, clinical services. How do those transform? But the key is for the individuals to see themselves as playing a role as co-creators of health.
Omid, you have about 1 minute.
Perfect. I think I'm going to make it. So it's a 4-pillar of change process where there is a period of self-reflection. Where am I and where are we as an organization disconnected? We provide ecologically trauma-informed education. Then each individual goes through a process of what we call self-emergence, self-examination of their own story to uncover their authenticity, a vision for self-actualization. From that, you uncover your intrinsic values, your core values. And then you work together to emerge into the group for creative purpose and to see the organization as something you caretake, and that its goal, whether you're making microchips, you're in a healthcare organization, or you're the YMCA of Los Angeles, everything should be about health. All problem solving is health. In one form or another, it should be improving our lives. We are working at a major child welfare agency called McKinley Child Center, training their employees to through this model and implementing also the HOPE model and the clinical services. The HOPE model is same pillars, but instead of reflection, it's crisis, because the individual comes in a clinic because they've reached that crisis. They don't need to reflect, they know they're not well. And so it's how am I disconnected from my wholeness? And the symptoms are seen as signals that we need to change. And then, but we take them through the same process. And in a clinic, we're working with people to see that their work is done when they're able to find their tribe, where they can connect and bring creative purpose to their lives and self-actualization. And we believe people can completely heal, completely recover. And the number one thing that I think matters is at the end of my assessment, I tell people you can get completely better. And so we're working with the organizational transformation with the Y of Greater Los Angeles, 26 branches, meeting with their C-suite and the executive directors of those branches, because it starts with leadership. Culture change is the key. And those leaders then learn this model and become elders within their organization to transform their organization bottom up through that 4-pillar process. Because culture is the driving force. Leadership creates the conditions. That's the key, is to get leaders to transform first and hold accountability to the organization to support bottom-up practices. personal responsibility for self-care, relationships based on interdependence, creativity based on purpose and health, and to rewrite the story from a sickness to an empowering approach. And last slide, all parts of the whole. We do this together, bottom up, and that's how we transform society.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for leading us and opening our discussion. And I want to, as you take off your slides, I want to just highlight one thing you said. There's so many things I could highlight. I'm going to highlight that we are interdependent. And instead of self-regulation, that we co-regulate. And one of the reasons why we have so much extra heartache during this pandemic, there's so many things to be upset about, but we've been sequestered and we haven't been able to actually feel each other and be in contact with our felt sense inside our bodies with each other. And so the level of disconnect, dysphoria, despair is really high because of that as well. And so as we're hearing all the panelists talk, let's really think about what in my organization, wherever our participants are from, what can we do to change some of the language we use and how we look at health and healing? So we are now going to move to my friend, Miguel Rivera. Miguel is a son of a physician and nurse. He was born in Guatemala. He is Spanish Mayan of descent, Quechan, and he is a sacred drummer, ritual keeper, and has held healing ceremonies with many elders and wisdom keepers for individuals, families, communities suffering from trauma, addiction, PTSD. He was taught by Wallace Black Elk, and he is integral to working with at-risk programs through Shade Tree, Western Gateway Roots and Wings Foundation, Soldier's Heart with Ed Tick, and translates the poems of Humberto Acabal. And one poem, Para Quienes, which means for those, I'm going to read for him. For those, Para Quienes. For those who do not speak our languages, we are invisible. For those who do not speak our languages, we are invisible. And I chose that particular poem because if someone is disenfranchised, if we don't understand their culture or their actual speaking language, they are invisible to us, and we need to change that. Miguel Rivera has also offered, I just learned today, over 5,000 prayer sweat lodges. And what I know about him is he gives blessings to people to be who they truly are. And for that, I'm grateful. And I turn it over to Miguel Rivera.
Toby, so much for inviting me to be here today. And thank you, Omid, for sharing your beautiful words with us. So I want to begin by inviting all of us who are participating today to just, for a moment, just stop. Wherever you are, doesn't matter what time zone, what part of the planet you're in right now, just stop for a moment and take a deep breath. And you feel yourself connected to the earth you are on, wherever that is. I don't care what floor you're on, first floor, second floor, 13th floor, 50th floor. Just feel yourself connected to the earth you are on, wherever that may be. Mountains, plains, wherever it is, what state, what country, just feel yourself connected to the earth and breathe it in deeply. Feel that earth calling you. Answer back to that earth. Feel it. All the history, all the elementals of that place where you are now. And also feel your ancestors, communing with those ancestors, right? They are there, were there, have been there for a long time. So as you feel that, breathe deeply into your body. Feel your ankles, your knees, your hips, your wrists, your elbows, your shoulders, your neck, with your jaw tightening up, right? Just breathe. We are very busy, busy creatures, always on our way to somewhere, coming from somewhere. So we find ourselves often not present in the moment. So I invite all of us to be here present today in these few minutes that we have together to invoke a consciousness, a state of being that connects us all. Even though we don't know each other, we don't know where we are in the world, we're creating a web of energy right now that's inviting healing to come to the place where we are. So with that in mind, Toby was kind enough to share the words of my friend Humberto Acabal, the poet, Maya Quiche. And the poem I'm going to share with you now starts this way. It says, roots tell us through the flowers what the earth is like on the inside. Roots tell us through the flowers what the earth is like on the inside. Las raíces nos mandan a contar por medio de las flores como la tierra es por dentro. And I want you to feel that deeply. You are a root. You have a particular connection to essence, to source, that cannot be compromised or contained in any way, shape, or form by anything in this world. That is uniquely who you are. So I want you to feel that, how you are connected to source directly. We will continue working on this, but for the time being, as Toby was saying, I was born and raised in Guatemala, and I felt like an alien. My mother was from the United States, my father was from Guatemala, and I'm a total mutt. My father's roots are Spanish, Maya Quiche, and then my mother is Polish, right? So I didn't have a sense of belonging in the world, not when I was a kid in Guatemala. I always felt incredibly transparent. So it came time for us to move to New York, and basically, it was even worse when I got to the United States. But I struggled, and I'm trying to figure out how to make meaning of this. My father was a surgeon, right? And so the house in which I grew up in, it was a part of it was a hospital, part of it was a clinic. So anytime you open up the door, there would always be somebody knocking at the door, was always looking for a doctor, wanting to tell something about a doctor, and all kinds of strange things would show up at the door. Food would show up. My parents, my uncle also was a surgeon too. After my father died in 1956, he took over the clinic, and my mother built a small hospital in the back of the house. So people didn't have a lot of money. We're very poor in some parts of Guatemala. So they pay however they could. Loads of firewood would show up, eggs, chickens. Mysteriously, one time somebody left a basket with two girls, twins, in one of the doors of the house. I'll come back to that later. But so you never knew what happened. Well, I remember one time opening up the door, and there was a guy who'd been hit by lightning who was looking for the doctor. So I grew up with that. So it's funny because my granddaughter was interviewing me last night. She wanted to know about my life. And so she asked me, did you want to be a doctor like your father? And I really, I'll explain the answer that I gave her. But when I was growing up, I always heard that you're going to be a surgeon just like your father. My uncle would take me on rounds in the hospital. I would go do house calls with him, and I would watch him operate because he was a surgeon too. So from the age of, say, 9 years old, I already knew what being in the medical field would be like, what the responsibility is, and what it involves to be a healer. So it came time to move to New York, and one of the jobs that I got, I worked as an orderly in an emergency room for 2 years, one day on, one day off. I did basically, my job was to take information. This is 1969 in upstate New York, a very small hospital. So I would take people's names, addresses, insurance information, and wrong. And sometimes I would have to administer first aid, CPR, whatever. I could do those basic things. But I remember two things specifically from those years in my as an orderly in the emergency room. Number one, a lot of the surgeons that were working in the emergency room were also studying to be psychiatrists. Now, if you're a healer, you're always looking for where the root of the disease is, and sometimes it's not in the body, right? There was one thing. And the other thing is I would see it in people's eyes, faces, that they were looking to be somewhere, and they would let all kinds, and I say it this way, even though sometimes I've been corrected by other individuals, but people will do terrible things to themselves or allow terrible things to happen to them so they could go somewhere where they could be safe. And later on, and you'll figure out why after I mention this, But I realized that terrible things were happening in their homes. And the best way for them to get out of that and find safety was to go to a hospital. At the end of my 2-year stint, I decided that maybe that path was not for me, but although I wanted to stay and help people figure out how to work with people in some form. So eventually I ended up becoming a professional musician. I toured around the country with a very well-known singer in the 1970s. We used to do concerts for, 50, 30,000 people. And at one point we were in New York, we were doing a gig, and a woman came up to me. I used to like to pack my gear at the end of the show. I don't like the roadies handling on my drums. So I was putting away my gear, and she goes, "Can I talk to you for a moment?" And I said, "Sure." She goes, "I want to thank you for saving my life." And I go, "Tell me about it." And she said, "I was going to kill myself. And then I saw the picture of your album, this album that we were promoting at the time, and I bought it. And through the music, I decided not to kill myself. So I want to thank you for saving my life." So that was a really interesting. So I realized if I had done one deed in my life, I had saved this person's life, that was a good thing. And I was living in Colorado at the time. So I eventually moved to LA in in 1979. In 1980, I had the fortune, again through music, of meeting Native American elders who were looking for young people to teach. So I met Marcellus Williams and Wallace Black Elk, Grace Spotted Eagle, Raymond Stone, and several other medicine people that would just wanted to teach something about Native ways because they didn't want to die without passing it on. So I ended up learning the first ceremony we were taught how to run was Sweat Lodge, and then we all ended up vision questing, and several else ended up sun dancing. If you know about the ceremonial cycles, they're very complex ceremonies that involve a great deal of preparation, also some arduous tasks like going without food or water for a number of days. But in the process of learning these ceremonies, what I realized is the gift that these elders were imparting on us. And part of it was, especially in the 1980s, we were talking the crazy thing about is people were all hot to go to celebrate the 500th anniversary of Columbus's arrival on these lands. Now, for Native peoples, that is a horrible, horrible thing, right? So my second year of Sundancing, we were up outside of Ashland, in the hills outside of Ashland, and the intercessor said to us, "Your people could not do this for us when they first came, could not do this with us when they first came over 500 years ago. On their behalf, you're doing it now." And the implication of that went into my body like a lightning bolt. And to this day, it affects me as I'm telling you the story now, because I realize that there's rituals, retroactive rituals that allow our ancestors to commune with each other in a number of ways that they couldn't do, understanding each other's functions as cultural functions and how they are complementary and not competitive with each other. Marcellus, my grandfather Marcellus would always say, everything that I'm going to share with you is not intended to compete or replace or create conflict inside of you with what you already know, but it's intended to expand it. And he would also say this very emphatically, our job is not to add to the confusion of the world, which we repeat all the time. So that kind of legacy in the language that they use now in the culture, for instance, decolonialize, decolonize, abolitionist, what do? You have to get interest. Each person, each individual, each culture has medicine, has power, has a way of understanding the universe. And we are not, they should not be competitive with each other, but they should be complementary, right? So we're talking about, Omid was talking about incongruousness, incoherence. I also have been involved in film and television for a number of years in audio. And one of the terms that we use here is phase coherence, right? And so when you're phase incoherent means that parts of the spectrum cancel each other out. So there's parts of ourselves that are canceling each other out because they're not in synchrony, they're not synchronized with each other. So what are those aspects? Incongruence, right? So you're talking about understanding how deeply these thought patterns are seated in the culture, right? Omid was talking about belief structures. To me, I've been studying this for a long time, and I realized that some of the cultural patterns that drive us to compete or be antagonistic towards each other are embedded, right? When you look at the systems that were put into place by Aristotle, right, 2,500 years ago, he codified that kind of split between mind and body, between spirit and matter, right? And these things are not to be competitive, but complementary, and there's interests with each other. So to go back to the sweat lodge story, right? Years ago, a friend of mine was going to get married, and Toby and Mark, he's a good friend of ours. And he said, I'm going to get married, and it's complicated, and I want you to do the wedding. And the particulars were that it was two different ethnic groups, right? The ethnicities of the two people getting married. So I thought about it, and I thought about it, and I thought about it, and I started working my way backwards. And I realized that if all peoples from all over the world have creation stories, and if you go down to the beginning of the creation story, it's exactly the same. In the beginning, there was nothing. So if I work my way backwards in the prayer for this wedding, all the way back to the beginning, who's going to argue with nothing? So that's the way I did. And I said, when I got to that wedding day, I said, before there was humans, there was the land and the plants and the animals, and before the elements and blah, 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 and all the way down to where there's nothing. So this is where we're going to pray for now, is going all the way back to the beginning. Omid mentioned lodge. I've been running lodges for the better part of 40 years. And the structure, the ritual structure of the lodge is you go back to two different points of origin and you reenact mythologically, archetypally, that process. And one of them is the creation of the universe. When we build fire, this is what we're doing. We're recreating the creation of the universe. We're also, it symbolizes the creation of the human being, insemination, gestation, and emerges from the mother. So you go back to two different points of origin. So what I like to say, and especially about 15 years ago, I got asked by a rehab facility here in Malibu to run sweats for the clients. And so first it was once a month, then it was twice a month, then it was once a week, and not only for clients but also for staff. And they realized what the what the necessity was for this. You know, I'm sorry, I'm getting a prompt here, but anyway. So the bottom line is that the ritual structures that we have allow us to commune with the universe and connect us, disconnect. And so I've been working with veterans, at-risk youth for a number of years. And in the process, we're bringing initiation into the picture, rites of passage, to allow for levels of violence that exist in the culture. We've been working with veterans. We go to Hawaii, we go to different parts of the country. And also at the same time, we recreate the coming together of the cultures the way it ought to have happened, not the way it did. So, and I think what's really important, and I wanted to mention this today too, is for me, the healing is an art. It's not an industry. So we have to consider changing that from a medical industrial complex to healing arts way of being with people. This is really important. And also all the terms, for instance, depathologizing the culture, you know, how they say now on the spectrum, or I like to say full spectrum, which is much, much different. We are functioning, we have cut ourselves off from different parts of our being. Omid mentioned spiritual, mental, emotional, and physical connected to the environment. This is how I like to look at that, how to integrate all that. When we are in this world, we fully participate with the world, even in death. We should allow ourselves to feed. The earth feeds us. Let us feed the earth in our death. I'll tell you a story. About 15 years ago, I was at the gravesite of my mother's youngest sister. And as I'm seeing her body being buried, you know, she's totally embalmed in a metal casket being put into a concrete enclosure. And I'm going, this is so wrong. This is so wrong. This is so wrong. So we should be able to be food for plants and the animals of this world because we have taken so much from them. You know, a friend of ours' wife, that wedding that I was talking to you about in the beginning, when she died, she wanted to be buried in the middle of her yard so that all the plants and trees that flowered would feed from her ashes. So this is how gracious some of these folks are in terms of understanding their relationship to the earth. So I think I'm going to cut it here short because I know how time constraints are, and I would love to hear Louis. So if you're interested, I put up a list of books that I strongly recommend that you do, because what I'm trying to do is expand the parameters with which you understand the world. And this is a semantic process, you know, right? I'll say this very clearly. You have to understand that we are trying to create mnemonic experiences that basically help you to remember how holy and sacred you are in relationship to the world. So let this experience here today be a mnemonic device that's implanted in you. Atoms, molecules, cells, nervous tissue remember this moment. And the complementary poem that I wanted to say is love each other like the roots that with all of the power of the earth love and they until they burst into flower. Love each other like the roots that with all of the power of the earth love until they burst into flower. And I also want to leave you with this. Stevie Wonder says, turn your words into truth and turn that truth into love. And this is how we're going to get through this, to remember that. All right. So thank you all very much. Thank you, Omid, and please, all right, take care of each other. Bye.
Thank you so much, Miguel. I want to highlight a couple of things that you said. That we have to understand our culture and all the cultures where people come from, and that there is medicine in everyone's culture. So we have to know their story so we know the right medicine, right? Also that music is medicine, art and creativity is medicine. It could save someone's life. And that we need to bring people back into rites of passage, ritual, ceremony, so that we're really embodying what it means to move from one stage of our life to the next. So thank you for all those reminders. And our third panelist is Dr. Louis Mehl-Madonra. Louis was born from mixed Scottish and Cherokee ancestry. And I know he brings a deep understanding of listening, of community, and the sacred. I've sat next to him in ceremonies and workshops. I've learned a great deal from him. I thought I had all of his books on my shelves. Apparently I'm missing one, but I'll rectify that today. He was trained by in conventional medicine and also by his indigenous elders. Author of many, many books, Coyote Medicine, Coyote Healing, Narrative Medicine, Remapping Your Mind, the Neuroscience of Self-Transformation, and many, many others. And there is a quote from Coyote Medicine that I wanted to say. The quote is, I realize that hearing and telling stories are integral to healing. By hearing stories about healing from people like us, by hearing stories about healing from people like us, we become inspired to believe that our own healing is possible. And the diagnosis is one marker of the journey he or she has traveled. Only one marker. And Dr. Servin Schreiber, professor from the University of Pittsburgh, described Dr. Mehl-Madonra in this way. He is an extraordinarily gifted physician and healer. I saw him transform the lives of profoundly affected patients. Dr. Mehl-Madonra is also the author of many scholarly articles, from micronutrients to healing circles, a wide variety of ways to look at healing. I want to thank you for being here. I want to thank you for all you do, that you have changed my life and my practice. Dr. Mehl-Madonra.
Thank you so much. I'm really honored to be here. And all of my colleagues told me that since my spirit was traveling to Southern California, I had to come back with a description of the weather. So before we end today, I'm going to ask you to give me a description of the weather so I can satisfy them. And I have some images that I wanted to put up. And so I'm going to share my screen. And let's see. So, I really want to thank you guys for having me. I'm really honored because, I live in a town of 4,000 people, and you've brought my spirit to Los Angeles, which is full of angels and many thousands of people. And so I'm very honored by that. And I want to acknowledge the indigenous people of where you are and also where I am. The Wabanaki, which means the people of the dawn. These are the people with whom I work, and also to our esteemed elder, Albert Marshall, whom I'll talk about in a little bit. And so one of the things I want to talk about is relational versus transactional medicine. And it was during medical school at Stanford University, which is just a little bit north of you, and I think you play them in football. Though I don't know who usually wins, but I suspect USC. And so indigenous medicine is all about relationships. And this is a picture of one of those, we call them an ipikaga, but I think Miguel was calling them sweat lodges. This is a picture of one of these structures. And what is relational medicine? It's the idea that what is really important is the relationship that you have with another person. And it's still true that almost all studies of psychotherapy outcome show that the most powerful factor is relationship. and it controls between 65 and 75% of the variance. And whatever technique you use pales in comparison to the relationship that you have with the other person. So what is transactional medicine? It's what we do in conventional medicine. It's a transaction. Person comes in, we try to figure out how to maximize the billing that we can perform on this person. They present a symptom. We present a drug for them to take for the symptom. And we try and minimize relationship because we're suspicious of relationship, that it's somehow not professional to have a relationship with other people. And so that moves us into individualized medicine, which is what elders do. And I remember an elder whom I took to a medical conference in Alberta to sit on a panel. And a nurse in the audience asked him how he treated arthritis. And he said to her, "I don't know her. Why don't you bring her around to the house tomorrow and I'll get to know her and then I'll let you know what I might do." And clearly his tongue was in his cheek, but he was pointing out a difference between the conventional Eurocentric medical system and his way of seeing the world, that he dealt with people and their imbalances, and it wasn't important to him what the allopathic diagnosis was. So while you look at this picture of Native American church from the inside, I want to talk a little bit about a client with whom I worked. And at the time I thought I did very little. And when she was interviewed for a documentary film, I realized what I had maybe done that was useful. So I want to share this story. So once upon a time, I was sitting in my office, and in walked a woman who was half Lakota, who had been hospitalized 375 times psychiatrically, and had attempted suicide more than 75 times. And she plopped herself down in the chair and dared me to fix her. At which point I just said, "What, me? How?" and I laughed, as I do today, And she said, "Well, you're the doctor, aren't you some genius or something? Fix me." And I said, "I can't fix you. Look at all the people who've tried to fix you. I don't know what to do for you." And she proceeded then to tell me her story, which took about 8 hours. And I was running hour sessions at that time, so that was 8 one-hour sessions. Because, as you know, you can't bill for more than an hour. So I am constrained by the biomedical system. But anyway, so then she finished and she said, um, so how are you going to treat me? I said, I don't know. I said, you've been on all the drugs. You've tried every combination known to psychiatry. You know more about drugs than I do. I don't know what to do. I mean, if you tell me you want to try a certain combination, fine. I'll send in the prescription. But you're going to have to decide because, to tell you the truth, you're way out of my league. You're much more sophisticated in psychiatry than I am. And so then she said, well, so what are we going to do? And I said, well, I could tell you stories. And so I proceeded to tell her stories. And, we incorporated a few other things into our meetings, some acupuncture and some osteopathic treatment. And, we just kind of hung out together and had fun. And I told her stories. And I didn't really think much about it. I just figured something was happening because she kept coming back. And um, and so one day she said, "Hey, I want to go to one of those groups you guys do." And I said, "Well, why don't you go?" We had several groups. We had fragile minds, complicated minds, and opiated minds. Those were our three groups. I said, "Why don't you go to Fragile Minds? That's kind of a cool group." And so she started going to Fragile Minds. And in Fragile Minds, you could do anything to music. And so she started painting in Fragile Minds. And in Complicated Minds, people often fought with each other for who was crazier than anyone else. And one of my favorite stories from Complicated Minds was two women competing about each of them telling the way they tried to kill their boyfriends, and trying to figure out who was the more lethal. So Complicated Minds was pretty complicated. And at one point she said, "Well, I'm ready for Complicated Minds." And I said, "Are you sure?" "They're complicated." She said, "Well, so am I." I said, "All right, come on in." So she's joined Complicated Minds. And, she just kept coming and I just kept telling her stories. And one day she announced that she was tired of being crazy. I said, "Really?" And she said, "Yeah, it's getting boring." And she said, "I'd really rather do something else." She said, "I think I'm going to start exercising, start eating well, and do all those stupid things that everyone tells me to do." And I said, "Okay." And so she did. And she started getting amazingly better. And she started getting off all of her drugs, which weren't working anyway, I don't think. And started feeling better, which probably made sense considering that she got off all the drugs that weren't working. And she started to thrive and to blossom. And she started to do art and to sell her art and and I was just like, wow, this is amazing. And I didn't think I did anything. But in when she was interviewed for this documentary, um, which was, kind of a fluke that it happened, um, they asked her, they said, "Well, what did Madrona over there do to help you?" And she said, "You know, he believed in me." She said, "He never gave up on his vision that I could be well. And he never told me what to do. And he just kept hanging out with me and believing me. And at one point I said, well, if he believes so much in me, maybe I should believe in me too. And I should just get well." And so she said, "I did." And I thought, yeah, you know, that's patient-centered care, which is what we talk about in conventional medicine. We're supposed to do patient-centered care, which we don't. I mean, I can say that because I work every month in the hospital as an inpatient attending, and I know how terrible our informed consent delivery is. So I know how we manipulate people into doing what we want and not necessarily what they might choose given their values. Um, but, um, the more radical idea is that maybe the way conventional medicine sees the world isn't the only way or the best way. Maybe there's other ways. And, even the National Institutes of Mental Health is critiquing and rejecting DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of the American Psychiatric Association, which, as I saw in one study, gets republished and advanced anytime the sales fall off on the old edition. So apparently the sales have fallen off because we now have DSM-5 TR that we all have to learn and follow as the Bible. But, what about the idea that maybe stories are a better way to understand people's suffering rather than labels? And I just want to give you one of my favorite quotes in all the world from one of my favorite authors, who's Leslie Marmol Silko. And she said, "I will tell you something about stories. They aren't just entertainment. Don't be fooled. They are all we have, you see. All we have to fight off illness and death. You don't have anything if you don't have the stories." And just today, I was speaking with the director of counseling for one of the reservations here in Maine, and they're going to a new electronic health record. And she said, "We want to build in stories into the electronic health record. We want to figure out how to get the life story and positive things about people into the health record, and not just all these negative check boxes." And I said, "Yeah, let's do that." And so we set up a day, first day of July, for us to get together and transform their electronic health record into something indigenous. And the problem is that the conventional medicine doesn't believe our evidence. They don't believe indigenous wisdom because it doesn't involve randomized controlled trials. One of my colleagues, Walter Lindquist at the Center for Addictions and Mental Health in Toronto, was charged with writing a white paper on evidence to support indigenous cultural interventions. And there's no RCTs. And there's a reason for that. And it's what I just presented to you. It's that elders don't accept the allopathic system of diagnosis. And so they're not, if you told them, "Okay, well, I've got a bipolar 2 here. I'm going to give you 50 of them and I want you to treat them all the same," they would just laugh at you like you were an idiot. They were like, "They're not all the same. They're not all imbalanced in the same way. How in the world would I treat them all the same? That's lunacy. That's crazy." And yet, that's why we don't get any grants to do RCTs of traditional healing, because we can't get them to do it all the same from the framework that they reject from the outset. And I also wanted to mention Christopher Lalonde's work, who studied indigenous communities in British Columbia and found that there were virtually no suicides in communities in which 50% or more of the people were fluent in the language. He found one suicide among 56 communities. Among those communities in which people had lost their fluency in the language, the rate of suicide was dramatically greater than the Canadian average. And so culture matters. So I want to talk about where I work, which is Wabanaki Public Health and Wellness. And we serve the 5 reservations of Maine, the 5 tribes, the 5 reserves, which are the Penobscot, the Pescatamacat. There's 2 Pescatamacat reserves, the Maliseet and the Mi'kmaq. And so, how do we do things? Well, our emphasis is on relationship, so that getting the story is more important than getting the data. Like, I want to know your life story before I ask you all the dumb questions that I need for my checkbox that gets us the maximum billing level allowed. And it turns out that generally when I get your story, I can fill in the checkboxes without further ado. And and it helps that we're not trying to maximize our income on each person. We're trying to meet people where they are, and sometimes that means going to their house. I do lots of home visits on the reservation. Sometimes it means driving around in a pickup truck looking for people, which we do. It's like, which relative are they hiding out at? We'll find them. And it means you're being trauma informed, understanding that so much of what's going on comes from interactions with European cultures. It comes from epistemological genocide, which is that idea that the way we think is stupid, superstitious, and should be abandoned. It comes from intergenerational trauma, from the reservation system. And I'll just mention that in Maine, you're not allowed to start a business if you live on the reservation. So, how is that going to help you achieve economic security? And it's a crazy law based in this idea that if you're not paying state taxes, you shouldn't be able to work, really, or to flourish. And of course, we can't ignore historical trauma. In 1675, a Passamaquoddy scalp was worth $25, which was an amazing amount of money in 1675. And so we have people who can't work sitting on reservations with no meaning or purpose, experiencing cultural genocide. So bringing culture into what we do is really important. And just for fun, you're being exposed to some of my amateur photography. And this is the entrance to our Sundance grounds where we go in South Dakota. It says Pejuta Ishnale Naji, medicine that stands alone. And it's just kind of fun. And this is another photo of driving into our Sundance grounds. So we're small at Wabanaki. And my belief is that you can't grow forever and remain relational. And there's a point at which you have to bifurcate. And indigenous people knew that. When communities grew too large, they would split up. That's been confirmed by archaeologists and anthropologists for referencing thousands of years. And so what we have are these health systems that grow larger and larger based on a certain plantation capitalist philosophy of growth and scalability, that you can always make things larger and they'll work just as well as they did when they were smaller. And they don't.
Louis, we have 1 minute. Just want to tell you that.
Okay.
Sorry to interrupt.
That's okay. That's okay. I knew I would run out of time, like everyone does. Death comes to us all in one form or another, metaphorically or literally. And I just want to finish with Eptuaptamunk, which is two-eyed seeing, the idea that indigenous knowledge is as valid as biomedical knowledge. And we've started a journal, Eptuaptamunk, the Journal of Two-Eyed Seeing, and I want to invite people to check it out, that we're hoping to get our first edition, online edition, out by June 1st. And we need your papers. Send us your articles about explanatory pluralism, seeing things in more than one way. We're open to papers about fishing, geology, psychiatry, and all other areas. So And I just want to show you a picture of our elder, Albert Marshall, who's our honorary editor-in-chief and our inspiration, who's really brought this term, Mi'kmaq term, Eptuoptimunk, and the correlative Mi'kmaq term, Netutkalimk, into the larger world. So with that, I'll say thank you very much. And that's all, folks.
Thank you. Thank you, Louis. I want to highlight a couple of things before we, please start writing your questions. This is for the audience. Please write your questions in the Q&A section, comments and questions. So a book I could recommend based on what you just said, Louis, is Returning to the Teachings. It's a really powerful book that everyone in healthcare should be reading about really thinking about other ways to look at science. You know, I heard you say, all three of you talk about relationship, and no one talked about fixing. There's nothing about fixing here, and that everyone here believes in the person that they're working with, that the reason why your patient M was able to get better was because you believed in her. And I know that we've talked in other workshops that we put on at IHW how important it is to look at the person in front of you, their soul that you know is in there, not just their behavior and not just their diagnosis, but their soul that you know is underneath all of that. And if we can do that, then they'll believe it too. And that we're all really victims of many systems that aren't working, many systems that aren't working here. So if all of you want to unmute, and if there's some things that you want to say to each other while I look at questions to answer, please go ahead.
I think what I wanted to just expand on what you said about, I've heard so many people's stories, and what's interesting to me is, I'm not interested. I'm not interested in fixing, but I'm interested into knowing what happened. That's what I like to go all the way back to the beginning. What happened? Most people that I work with, in many cases, you have to understand what the conditions were when they were conceived. What was going on in the house? One of my dear friends, we do a lot of work with anti-recidivism. And I said to him, if you were to do if you were to imagine a world without prisons, what would you say? What would you recommend? He said 2 words: better parenting. I was going deep, you know.
Right. When I work with anyone, I ask, who are your people? I want to know where you were brought up, who your ancestors are, what the medicine is in their culture. And every time I ask that question, the response I get is, thank you for asking that. No one's ever asked me that before. And let me tell you about my people. Or I don't know who my people are, and maybe I should find out. And just that journey of looking into who someone's ancestors are and who what their language is and what their culture is healing in and of itself. So we have, please, Omid, go ahead, and then we have 2 questions.
Well, when Miguel said what happened, and something you just said, Toby, you know, I did a whole presentation that didn't refer to me and my story at all. It made me think of a thing to say is, you know, a big part of the gift I got was growing up in a very traditional culture, Iranian culture, Iranian Jewish, and coming here. And I think, you know, the intense polarization in our politics, and also going through healthcare systems and thinking about systems, our healthcare systems, and changing them. And my culture really, you know, I see America and our culture, like our society is so split. And I think being from the outside, I see the polarization when I'm in very conservative circles. I'm like the I'm the antagonist there. And and liberal circles, I'm in the antagonist there. And like, I think the split happened in the 50s. I think that what happened has a lot to do with the 50s and the split that happened there. And, there's, because I part of what I'm trying to say, like about you said, relationship and cooperation is our nature, but also self-empowerment is our nature. And the Sweat Lodge, Vision Quest, these transformational experiences, they force the individual to find their power. And I think we also have to talk about health is not, I don't think it's right to say health is a right. I think health is an achievement. It's something that we have to strive for, and we have to bring that's where meaning comes, is that struggle. And when we also that we need to give that to people as well, that personal responsibility for their health. And these large bureaucratic systems, like I really love that part, Lewis, where you said, people split when the group gets too big, because it's our circuitry can really trust that. And like these large systems that want to care for people are I think part of the problem, versus on the ground communities caring for themselves and individuals caring for themselves.
On that's a great time to ask a question. So from the audience, how might we get leaders in academic medicine to open their minds and hearts to these kinds of perspectives?
So I want to repeat the words of a famous physicist who said that science advances one funeral at a time. And I think I don't have an answer to the question, except that we just have to keep talking and hope that the young people will pick up the message, and when they become deans and associate deans and assistant deans, that they'll, change the institution, change the academy. One of my friends just sent me a reference to a paper, Scott and Fonseca 2010, Critiquing Ethics Review Boards and Their Tendency Toward Empiricism's Certainty, Clarity, and Control. And we're stuck, we're caught in that system. I just spent a year and a half getting a study through the Ethics Review Board that's simply collecting life stories. And they were terrified that if people gave me their life story, they would then want to kill themselves. And I said, I've collected, more than 500 life stories, and nobody's ever wanted to kill themselves. And they said, well, it could happen. And I said, well, it turns out that there's a wealth of data supporting the idea that talking about your feelings about suicide reduces the risk. And they said, well, we don't believe that. And it took me a year and a half to get my study approved. And you cannot believe what I had to put in the consent form about risk. And I thought, this is so non-indigenous, because for me, if you tell me about your life, then I hold your life in my hands, and we form a sacred bond. And there's something beautiful and magical about that, and it has to be good for both of us.
It has to be good for both of us. That's right.
Yeah. But I'll happily say that my study is finally approved.
That's fantastic. We have a couple of comments in the chat that I want to read. Being in the mental health field, this talk today gives me hope that there are other ways to practice more human, more community oriented. Thank you for passing your wisdom on and inspiring us to continue working towards a more integrated world. And with what you were saying, Lewis, just the opposite would happen. Penny Baker did wonderful work around this in narrative medicine. We know of his work. And there's another question in the Q&A. How can we integrate some of the teachings you shared today into our curriculums? What would be maybe your first step that you would take? I could invite all of you to come and speak to our medical school, which is, I am going to do that. Go on.
I
Well,
was, oh, sorry, Louis, I didn't mean to cut you off. Go ahead.
go ahead. Well, I was going to say bring crazy people like us.
Yes.
Well, I happen, if you guys don't know who Daryl Davies is, he's an acquaintance of mine, but Daryl's gotten a lot of notoriety because he's Black and he goes out and he basically makes friends with people who belong to the KKK by inviting them to a meal. So you have to figure out that there's a way of creating community by recognizing the fact that people are in pain, and how do you get beyond that? So there's a neutral activity that creates reciprocity with each other, and that's an opportunity to find out.
Yeah.
You get them to tell their stories by sharing a process. We've
Yeah.
done this a number of times in Hawaii by building things, making food and cooking. So I think that's finding a neutral ground to understand how to learn from each other's cultures in an environment like that. And I think curiosity is a great way to start to deal with things.
Yeah. I think like that sitting together and reflecting, that's what you're talking about, Miguel, is like reflecting and you need intimacy. And I'll tell you, like the question before, how do you change leadership? I think it's leadership who can get it into the curriculum. And how do you change leadership? I think is by bridging that divide. I mean, it's remarkable to me, once I became a leader in an organization, how people stopped talking to me like I was somebody who was open when I was still the same person. So we project onto leaders a lot. And there's a lot of stories in our culture, about leadership and people who run things. And I think asking them how they're doing, we're working with the C-suite of the YMCA, like these are, and board members that are like very, very powerful men and women. And the self-examination part of the process, we have grown men and women crying about their lot, how they're disconnected, where they're hiding, where they're avoiding, how they're managing their symptoms through distraction. So I think we're at a time of crisis in our society, which is a great time of opportunity, because that's where the light comes in, is through the cracks. We are cracking, that the Y is doing what we're doing, that McKinley is doing what we're doing, that never would have happened 5-10 years ago. It's because the failure of the current old systems is so apparent that there is a readiness. So I think intimacy and like reaching out and going beyond the projections and the stories that we've inherited about how ready people are to talk about what's really going on.
And also, I mean, I try to have a medical student with me all the time. So, we call the rotation, um, indigenous community medicine, and it looks attractive to some institutions, so they send us students, and that's a way, and I used to teach in a residency program, but I found that, um, I left to work with the tribes, but I found that the other faculty were really critical of me being critical of you know conventional medicine, and I didn't think I was critical in a bad way. I thought I was being critical in a responsible way, like referencing Tufts, and, their criticisms of randomized control trials, and Oxford University and things like that. But I think what we're up against is just more so than ever before. There's a commitment to the conventional beliefs, to the guidelines, and an emphasis on don't question the guidelines, just learn them and follow them. Don't ask where the evidence came from. And just an example, I was criticized for encouraging residents to look at the number needed to treat with a statin to prevent a cardiovascular event and the number needed to harm. So the number needed to treat was around 230. And of those 230 people, 12 would develop diabetes from the statin. 40 would stop exercising because of the muscle problems from the statin. And the conventional answer was give everyone a statin. And I was saying, well, have we really looked at the data? But that was as if I was, doing a Solomon Rushdie and criticizing Muhammad. It was just unthinkable that we should talk like that. And I think we're in a dangerous period of overcommitment to authority and guidelines.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for saying all that. And as we're getting to 1:30, I just want to reflect on how I'm working with our medical residents and fellows. That's my job at USC, their wellness director. And what I have found over the last 6 years doing this is, and then more when I was at Vanderbilt, our young physicians are starving for real connection with their patients. That's why they came in to do this work. Our nurses are starving for it. Our therapists are starving for it. They want to spend more time. They want to hear the stories. And there's this moral injury that they have when they know that there's more to be done and they don't get to do it. And so they're hurting. They're really hurting because of it. And we saw so much of it during the pandemic. And so part of what I say to them is, please see what I'm doing with you, what we're doing together, and you can offer that too, which is being a real person, an authentic person who cares. And so on that note, we did record this. If some people came on late and you didn't see the whole thing, please go to our IHW website, and we'll also be sending our recording to everyone. And some people are saying, so great to see everyone. Lots of beautiful notices in our chat. And I want to say thank you to all of you from the bottom of my heart, all of you and all of your teachers. So all of you come from a long lineage of teachers, long lineage of ancestors. Thank you for what you do. Thank you for who you are. And to everyone who showed up today, everything that you do matters. Every word that you say matters. And every time you sit with someone and listen, it matters. So thank you, everyone, as we close off.